It was a heavy morning in Lagos, Nigeria. The year was 2007. Inside a crowded courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Journalists jostled for space, their cameras poised. Families of victims sat with clenched fists, some quietly praying, others simply staring into the distance. On the stand stood a man once revered by hundreds, feared by many more, Chukwuemeka Ezugo, better known as Reverend King. Wearing a faded prison uniform, his once charismatic face was a shadow of itself. Gone was the fiery preacher who commanded loyalty and devotion at the Christian Praying Assembly CPA in Lagos. In his place stood an accused murderer, awaiting the final word of the Nigerian justice system. When the presiding judge, Justice Joseph Oil, finally read out the verdict, guilty of murder and attempted murder, Reverend King was sentenced to death by hanging. The final act in a dark, complicated story had just been written. But how did it come to this? How did a man who claimed to be the mouthpiece of God end up becoming one of Nigeria's most infamous religious criminals? This is the true story of Reverend King, a story of power, control, faith, deception, and ultimately, deadly violence. Chukwuemeka Ezugo was born into a simple family in the southeastern part of Nigeria. Not much is known publicly about his early years, but those who knew him as a young man described him as intelligent, stubborn, and strangely charismatic. In the late 1990s, as the Pentecostal movement exploded across Nigeria, many young men seeking power and influence found their calling behind the pulpit. Ezugo was no different. He set up his church, the Christian Praying Assembly, and quickly grew a following. Located in the bustling Ajao estate in Lagos, CPA was a magnet for young people, especially students and low-income earners, who were drawn by King's fiery sermons about salvation, sign, and the end times. From the beginning, Reverend King did not behave like other pastors. He demanded absolute loyalty. He issued strict rules on dressing, dating, and even friendships. His followers referred to him as Daddy, a title he not only accepted but encouraged. To disobey Daddy was to disobey God. By the early 2000s, the Christian Praying Assembly was flourishing. Money flowed freely. Church members, most of whom lived hand-to-mouth, were still expected to give generously, often to the point of impoverishment. Yet they stayed mesmerized, trapped in a world where questioning King was seen as rebellion against God himself. And then the violence started. Behind the closed gates of CPA, a darker reality brewed. Members lived in fear of Reverend King's wrath. He was known to physically assault his followers for sins as minor as speaking to someone he disapproved of, or failing to follow his orders promptly. Punishments included public beatings, humiliations, and sometimes brutal floggings. King had created a system where guilt was everywhere. He spied on his members, encouraging others to report their fellow worshippers. Sexual abuse allegations swirled, though few dared to speak out. Some female followers later confessed that they had been forced to engage in inappropriate acts under the threat of spiritual damnation. Among those living under this terrifying regime was a young woman named Enuzo, later known by the pseudonym Kelechi to protect her family. Kelechi would become central to the tragic events that would later bring Reverend King's empire crashing down. Kelechi had joined the church hoping for spiritual upliftment. Instead, she found herself under constant accusation from Reverend King, who insisted that she had unclean spirits and needed constant correction. The environment at CPA was not one of love and spiritual growth but of fear, control, and domination. It was only a matter of time before the violence escalated beyond beatings to something far worse. It was supposed to be just another morning sermon. In July 2006, Reverend King accused 6 members of CPA of committing fornication, an unpardonable sin in his eyes. Furious beyond control, he decided they must be punished to save their souls. Kelechi was among those accused. She pleaded her innocence, but her cries fell on deaf ears. Reverend King was determined to cleanse them. In an act that would shock Nigeria, Reverend King ordered the accused to line up. He brought out a jug of petrol, doused them, and set them on fire. Kelechi suffered severe burns covering over 65% of her body. She and others were rushed to the hospital in agony. Despite doctors' efforts, Kelechi died days later from her injuries. The news spread like wildfire. Lagos, a city used to scandals and controversies, was stunned into silence. The police moved quickly. Reverend King was arrested and charged with murder and attempted murder. But even behind bars, King's hold over some of his followers remained frighteningly strong. Some insisted he was innocent, that it was the devil trying to bring down a man of God. Others, finally free from his shadow, began to reveal the horrors they had endured inside CPA. The trial of Chukwuemeka Ezugo, known to all as Reverend King, became one of the most sensational legal battles Nigeria had ever seen. From the moment he was brought before the court, it was clear the authorities wanted to send a message, not just to him, but to all religious leaders who had become tyrants behind the mask of spirituality. The case was tried at the Lagos State High Court, Ikeja, with Justice Joseph Oywole presiding. The courtroom, often packed beyond capacity, was a microcosm of Nigerian society. Some came seeking justice, others hoping to see a miracle for the man they still believed to be a prophet. The charges were severe: 1 count of murder for the death of Kelechi, 5 counts of attempted murder for the other victims, doused in petrol and set alight. The prosecution was led by seasoned lawyers determined to secure a conviction. Their case was simple. Reverend King, in a fit of uncontrollable anger, committed a heinous crime against his own church members. His act was deliberate, cruel, and fatal, but the defense was equally aggressive. Reverend King's lawyers painted him as a loving but misunderstood spiritual leader. They suggested the fire was an accident, that King had no intention to kill anyone, and that the prosecution was driven by anti-Christian bias. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric, almost surreal. Each day, Reverend King arrived in a convoy of prison guards, his figure lean and upright, a defiant gleam still in his eyes. He often brought a small Bible, clutching it to his chest. He refused to acknowledge the charges against him as legitimate. He claimed he was being persecuted for his divine mission. Witnesses began to testify, and the stories they told would leave the court stunned. One by one, former members of CPA came forward. They spoke of life under Reverend King, endless fasting that weakened them physically, midnight beatings for imaginary sins, being forced to confess fabricated crimes just to avoid harsher punishment, total surrender of their lives, relationships, money, even their thoughts, to the man they called Daddy. Several survivors of the petrol burning testified. Their voices trembled as they described that fateful day. "He said we had sinned," said one witness, whose body still bore the scars. "He brought petrol and matches. He poured it himself. He told us we must burn to be purified." The most emotional testimony came from the doctors who treated Kelechi before her death. A surgeon, visibly shaken, described how Kelechi's flesh peeled off at the slightest touch. She had screamed in unimaginable pain before slipping into unconsciousness and eventually dying. Throughout these testimonies, Reverend King sat impassively, occasionally flipping through his Bible, sometimes smiling faintly as if detached from the horror being described. When it was time for him to testify in his own defense, he stunned the court further. Taking the stand, Reverend King maintained his innocence. He denied pouring petrol on anyone. He suggested that the fire was a tragic accident, that Satan entered someone and caused the blaze. He argued that he was being targeted because he was a man of God who had dared to speak out against corruption and evil in society. He described himself as a victim of a grand conspiracy orchestrated by jealous enemies within and outside the church. His words, though confident, did little to sway the court. Too many witnesses, too many scars, both physical and emotional, too much undeniable pain. Even some of his once loyal followers who packed the court grew uncomfortable listening to his bizarre justifications. The prosecutors, during cross-examination, tore holes through his testimony, highlighting inconsistencies and pressing him with evidence that showed a clear pattern of abusive behavior long before the tragic fire. The trial dragged for months, with numerous adjournments, procedural debates, and media frenzies. Finally, in January 2007, after months of emotional testimony, shocking revelations, and community outcry, the court was ready to deliver its judgment. The morning of judgment was electric. Hundreds gathered outside the courthouse. Some came to celebrate what they hoped would be justice served. Others, still loyal to King, came to pray for his miraculous deliverance. Inside the courtroom, you could hear a pin drop as Justice Joseph Oywole entered. In a calm but firm voice, the judge detailed the evidence, the testimonies of the survivors, the medical reports, the forensic evidence that showed the burns were not accidental. In the end, the verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. The sentence was chilling in its finality. For the murder of Kelechi, death by hanging. For the attempted murders, 20 years imprisonment each, to run concurrently. As the words fell, a collective gasp rose from the courtroom. Some burst into tears, from relief, from sadness, from disbelief. Reverend King showed no emotion. He simply closed his eyes and mouthed a silent prayer. Outside the court, emotions boiled over. Some of his supporters collapsed on the ground wailing. Others quietly melted away, ashamed or disillusioned. Justice had been served, but the scars of Reverend King's reign would last much longer. The sentencing of Reverend King marked the collapse of his once feared empire. Christian Praying Assembly (CPA), which had at its peak attracted hundreds of followers, rapidly disintegrated. Without King's magnetic and tyrannical presence, the church lost its cohesion. The headquarters was deserted within weeks. Dust gathered on the once bustling compound. The sound of worship songs and the marching of obedient followers was replaced by an eerie silence. Some of his staunchest followers tried desperately to keep the church alive. They organized prayer meetings, hoping for his release, prophesying his return. They clung to the belief that Daddy was innocent, that he was a martyr suffering for his righteousness. But many others were too traumatized to stay. Some sought counseling. Others disappeared into anonymity, trying to rebuild lives shattered by years of control, fear, and abuse. The Lagos state government quickly moved to seal CPA's headquarters. The police kept a watchful eye, wary of any attempt to resurrect the cult-like movement. Media houses ran exposes on Reverend King's darker past, interviewing ex-members who spoke about incidents that had never reached the courtroom, forced celibacy vows, unreported physical assaults, financial exploitation, psychological manipulation. For many Nigerians, Reverend King's case became a symbol, a warning about unchecked religious authority. In a society where men of God were often placed on pedestals, his fall shook the public's blind faith in religious figures.